I wanted to share with you all, inshallah ta'ala, if you'll allow me a few minutes, um, uh, to set up kind of the point that I wanted to make that we didn't have time for. And before we do so, the question is, has anybody ever met a Zionist Palestinian before? I know somebody laughed. Has anybody met one before? No, no, so they do exist. Of course. Brother, if it's possible, it's, yani, there's probably something that exists, right? If it's, yani. So I have met, we actually, I have, he was a professor. Back when I was doing my undergrad and we were in the MSA, and he used to teach courses on Islam, even though he was not Muslim. He was Palestinian, but he's not a Muslim. He was Christian. But he's not even a practicing Christian, we found out. He was teaching courses on Middle Eastern history, Islam even. He had 2 courses on Islam. He was a so-called expert on Islam and whatnot. And he would say really messed up things. We heard about this. I never took, alhamdulillah, one of his classes. But once we heard these things, they said, you don't believe us? Come and sit in the class. I went and I sat myself in the class a few times just listening. This is not my class. I just went and attended this lecture. I'm listening to the stuff that he's saying, and I cannot believe it. And at one point, some of the students that were taking the class, I told them, you have to say something. They would get up, they would object, they would say, hey, what you're saying is this, what you're saying is that. He would laugh it off. He's like, oh, I'm just kidding, I'm just whatever. So we, as the Muslim Student Association, and we're all undergrads, we didn't really know what to do. So we went and talked to the university board. And in long story short, he ended up getting fired. Now, because he was tenured professor, you can't get fired. But because he was above the age of retirement, and apparently they had asked him to retire multiple times, and he refused, because he enjoyed teaching so much. He was in his late 70s at the time. So he wasn't officially fired. The university politely told him, you need to retire. Because this is not the first time that complaints have made. And now we made an effort. We'd spent months. We recorded everything. We documented our stuff. We went and everything like this. And alhamdulillah, he left. What's funny is that like a year or 2 later, I saw him at a Middle Eastern restaurant in the city. Of course, he didn't recognize me, even though, I mean, I had talked to him and I was one of the people that confronted him. He's dealt with so many students, he didn't know what was going on. And I started asking him, what's going on? He's like, oh, those stupid students, they got me this, and he was regretting it. He was, for it, but he didn't know who I was. So I could tell he knew what happened to him, but anyways, we confronted him multiple times, and so on and so forth. Even later, he tried to tour around the city talking about, at the time it was the war in Iraq, and there was this whole Sunni versus Shia thing. So they would bring him as an expert on Sunnism and Shiaism. And so we would show up to his events and ask him questions that would stump him. He wouldn't be able to answer, and he would look embarrassed. Later, I felt bad because, but anyways, this person exists, a Zionist Palestinian. You would never think that it does. Now here's the thing. Somebody from the outside could easily say, since there are some of these people that are Palestinian, but they're Zionists. They believe that what Israel is doing is fine, and in fact it has a right. These Palestinians have no claim to the land, even though it doesn't make any sense, but in some way it does. So a person might frame the argument as there's 2 sides. The Palestinian issue, there's 2 sides. You have the Palestinians, you have the Israelis. In fact, you have some Palestinians that agree with the Israelis. What do you say about that? How would you feel if somebody frames their argument like this? You can't. And because one person says something, هل له اعتبار؟ هل نعتبره شيء؟ ليس له اعتبار. Right? Why? Because of the overwhelming evidence on the opposite side. Every other Palestinian, you can bring 100 and you'll find 100 agreeing with the Palestinian cause. You literally have to look all over just to find 1 or 2 that agree with this position. And the problem is nowadays with the democratization of the internet, and there's a phenomenon called the death of expertise. Has anybody heard this phenomenon? In preparing for today's khutbah, there was a very good book that I went through. It's called The Death of Expertise, which means that now there's a push And by the way, this is before, and if somebody says, oh, this is exactly what Trump was doing, etc., he's just a symptom. This started actually before him. And in fact, even Muslims were saying it. And Muslims were saying it, some Muslims were saying it over 1,000 years ago, where we want to discredit or even tell people you don't need to listen to experts, you don't need to listen to people of knowledge, right? And if you do, look, here's an expert. This guy, he has a PhD. He does. He's an expert. Listen to him. But he's one guy. Does that make sense? And so a lot of times these issues are framed in the way that we give false equivalence and there's no more weight given anymore. If somebody's loud on the internet, we give it a lot of weight, even though the overwhelming majority are saying one thing. And one guy is saying the other, and we say, no, there's two sides to the issue. La ya akhi, there's no two sides. But because we don't have full comprehension of the issue, we're not aware, we haven't talked, we haven't been out there, a lot of times we'll get confused about what actually is going on. This happens, by the way, not in every, not just in, for example, with regards to COVID and what's going on, but even in Islam. How many times have we heard the statement, oh, these mashayikh don't know what they're talking about. That sheikh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Right? Why would a person say this? Because he has an opinion that goes against what the sheikh is saying and he doesn't like it. So in order to get his opinion, he just disregards the whole knowledge and whatnot. So we're not actually having a discussion on the actual proofs. Let's look at the data, let's look at the dalil, let's look at everything. Khalas. And by the way, let's say for example alcohol. Alcohol. Everybody here in agreement that alcohol is haram, right? If you went fatwa shopping, could you find a sheikh who tells you certain forms of alcohol are allowed? Yes, you can. In fact, it was a very famous classical opinion held by some scholars of a certain madhab. Not all of them, some. And in fact, later on this madhab corrected it and it's no longer a held opinion. But classically, they said some, not all, just to be clear, held the opinion that some forms of alcohol are fine because they weren't included in the list that the Prophet ﷺ had said. In that one hadith, of course there's other hadith that actually eliminate that argument. Everybody with me so far? So there could be some scholars nowadays, and there are, if you look hard enough, you'll find scholars who say alcohol is okay, certain forms. Do we give that any weight? So when I talk about alcohol, will I ever say, by the way, some scholars allow it? If we're talking about alcohol, will we ever say that? We won't ever say that. Why? Because now we're giving weight to a weightless position. We're giving weight to a weightless position. It has no legitimacy whatsoever. It's a wrong mentality. There's no proof for it whatsoever. So we don't even give it regard. But if we start giving regard to issues that they don't have a regard, or we know that they're actually harmful, we're actually doing a disservice. So a lot of times things are framed in terms of there's two sides when in fact there's no two sides. So that Zionist Palestinian, he's not on the other side. There is no other side once you actually know it. And that's something, this is a little harder, it takes a little bit longer to kind of explain, but this is what we call it. So the technical term for this is called equality bias, where we think that there are two sides to a debate when in fact there aren't. And people do this one of the ways that they do it is by discrediting the actual experts and then propping up people who are not experts. This is why the death of expertise, especially when we discredit the people of knowledge, people who have dedicated their lives to certain things, we do a disservice to a lot of people. This doesn't mean that we cannot engage in discussions with them. Even if I'm not an expert, I can discuss, I can understand. I have my own senses of logic, I've learned a little bit. I'm not an expert in your area, but I might be an expert in my own area. So it doesn't mean that I just close my eyes and close my ears and follow whatever the expert says. La. But at the same time, I have to realize if a person has dedicated years of their life to something, and I've only read about it for however long I've read about it, they're not the same.